Angola Prison sat like a fortress in the Louisiana heat, its massive walls swallowing the sounds of the outside world. Inside, death row stretched in a long corridor of steel and shadows, each cell holding a man whose story had ended long before his final day arrived. The air was heavy, the silence constant, broken only by the echo of footsteps or the metallic clank of keys against iron. It was a place where hope came to die, where men became ghosts before their bodies ever left. If you're drawn to stories that reveal unexpected humanity in the darkest corners, make sure to subscribe now. You won't want to miss what comes next. Michael Harris had lived here for 12 years. At 46, his face carried the weight of regrets that stretched far beyond the prison gates. Once a man who thought he could outrun mistakes with arrogance and speed, he was now a figure of quiet resignation. His cell was bare save for the essentials, a thin mattress, a few worn books, and letters he never opened. He had long stopped counting the days, long stopped believing anyone remembered him. The guards knew him as a man who caused no trouble. He followed orders, never raised his voice, and never joined in the shouting matches that sometimes erupted from other cells. Cooperative, they called him in their reports. But in private, among themselves, they had another word: gone. Michael was alive, breathing, eating the same meals, walking the same yard. Yet something inside him had been buried long ago. He refused visits from what little family he had left. His younger brother, who once wrote him faithfully, stopped after the letters came back unopened. His daughter, Rachel, had been 9 years old when he was arrested. Now she was an adult, somewhere beyond these walls. But to Michael she felt like a ghost from a past life. He told himself she was better off forgetting him, better off pretending he had never existed. Every morning was the same: the jangle of keys, the call for breakfast, the tray slid through the slot. He ate without tasting, moved through routines like a shadow, and returned to silence. There were men who clung to scraps of faith, praying aloud every night. Others sharpened anger into weapons, lashing out at guards or each other. Michael chose neither. He simply drifted, a quiet man waiting for the state to decide when his last walk would come. The younger guards sometimes wondered aloud if he felt anything at all. One night during rounds, Officer Ruiz whispered to a colleague, "That man's already dead. He just hasn't been buried yet." And in truth, Michael often wondered the same. Yet under that stillness something remained, a fragment of a man who once dreamed, who once cared, who once laughed. It lay buried under guilt, under years of self-punishment, under the crushing certainty that redemption was no longer for him. He never expected anyone, or anything, to reach that place again. But death row has a way of surprising even the most hardened souls. Change, when it comes, doesn't announce itself with a trumpet. Sometimes it arrives quietly, padded on 4 paws, with dark eyes that see past walls of steel and silence. Michael Harris did not know it yet, but his solitude was about to be interrupted. His first true visitor in years was not a relative, not a priest, not even a fellow inmate. It was a retired police dog named Shadow, and what happened on the day they first crossed paths would leave the guards questioning everything they thought they knew about men like him. For now Michael sat in his cell, head bent, staring at a book he had not turned the page of in hours. The corridor hummed with its usual quiet tension. He believed the days ahead would mirror all the ones behind. He was wrong. The days at Angola blended together with a rhythm so predictable it could suffocate a man's spirit. At dawn, the corridors filled with the metallic chorus of keys and boots, signaling the start of another cycle. Breakfast trays clattered through the slots: lukewarm eggs, a piece of cornbread, black coffee that tasted of bitterness more than caffeine. For most inmates, the mealtime exchange sparked noise: shouts for extra portions, curses at guards, conversations carried cell to cell. For Michael Harris, it was another silent ritual. He ate mechanically, eyes never lifting from the concrete floor. Silence had become his armor. While others filled the air with words, Michael let silence stretch like an invisible wall. The guards grew accustomed to it, though it unsettled them at times. Officer Daniel Ruiz once muttered under his breath, "Man acts like he's in a grave already." Another guard answered, "Maybe that's the only way he survives." Michael's reputation spread among both inmates and staff. Some called him the Ghost, others the Preacher without prayers. To the men around him, he wasn't dangerous, wasn't loud, wasn't violent. He was simply absent. Yet that absence weighed heavier than rage. Inside his mind, memories circled like vultures. He remembered the way Texas air smelled on summer nights, heavy with dust and gasoline. He remembered his father's stern voice telling him to make something of himself, to avoid the same mistakes that had haunted generations before. He remembered his brother, Matthew, the last one who tried to reach him with letters written in neat handwriting, full of family updates Michael pretended not to care about. Each envelope remained unopened in a pile beneath his bed, yellowing with time. But the memory that cut deepest was Rachel. She was only 9 when she last looked at him through the glass divider of a visiting room, her small hands pressed to the barrier as she whispered, "Daddy, when are you coming home?" He never answered her, and when her visit stopped, he told himself it was better this way, better for her to grow without the weight of a father behind bars, better for her to erase him than to carry his shame. Now, years later, Michael moved through death row like a man without a tether. His footsteps were measured, his posture straight but empty. Guards rarely spoke to him beyond necessity. Other inmates left him alone, either out of respect for his detachment or indifference to his ghostly presence. He wasn't hated, wasn't feared, he was simply forgotten. One evening, as lights dimmed and shadows thickened in the corridor, Michael sat cross-legged on his mattress, staring at a book without reading. The words blurred, his mind drifting into that quiet fog that had become his only refuge. Across the hall, 2 inmates argued loudly over a debt from a card game. Their voices carried insults, threats, and promises of retaliation. Michael did not react. He had trained himself not to. When Officer Carter passed by on her rounds, she paused briefly at his cell. She had only worked on the row for 6 months, but already noticed how different he was from the others. "You ever talk, Harris?" she asked softly. He didn't move, didn't blink, didn't acknowledge her presence. After a moment, she shook her head and walked on. Michael heard her words, of course. He heard everything, but silence was his last control. Words had once destroyed his life, promises broken, arguments shouted, lies spoken in courtrooms. Now, by withholding his voice, he could at least choose who received a piece of him. And the answer for years had been no one. Yet beneath the stillness a flicker stirred. It wasn't hope, not yet, but something restless. A man can bury himself in silence for only so long before even the smallest sound, a bark, a step, a presence, can fracture the walls. Though he didn't know it, Michael's quietest days were about to end. The announcement came on an ordinary Tuesday, slipped casually into the daily routine by Warden Mitchell. Standing at the front of the unit, his voice carried with the authority of someone used to men listening whether they wanted to or not. "Starting this week, we'll be introducing a new program on the row," he said. "Therapy animals. Dogs. They'll be here a few hours at a time. Don't cause trouble and maybe you'll get some benefit from it." The reaction from the cells was immediate. Some inmates laughed, others mocked the idea. "What's next, story time?" someone shouted. Another called out, "We're killers, not kids. Dogs won't fix us." The guards smirked or rolled their eyes, certain this experiment would end as quickly as it began. But Mitchell didn't waver. "You don't have to like it, you just have to behave." The following morning, the first visitor padded onto the row. A black German shepherd, his coat still glossy though his muzzle carried streaks of grey. He moved with quiet confidence, nose twitching, eyes scanning without fear. At his side walked Officer Emily Carter, the young correctional officer who had already earned a reputation for her persistence. Unlike some of her colleagues hardened by years on the job, she carried a belief that even men on death row deserved slivers of humanity. "This is Shadow," she introduced simply, her voice steady. "Retired police K9. Served 8 years on patrol before being reassigned here. He's trained, calm, and won't tolerate disrespect." The men behind the bars leaned closer, curiosity overcoming their bravado. Some whistled, others hissed or barked mockingly. Shadow ignored it all, his ears alert, but his steps composed. He wasn't there to entertain. He was there with purpose. Michael Harris remained seated on his bunk, arms crossed, eyes steady but indifferent. From his cell he watched as Shadow moved past, pausing occasionally at certain doors, sniffing the air as if weighing the souls behind each steel barrier. Michael's cell came near the end of the row, and though he told himself he didn't care, his chest tightened when the dog drew closer. When Shadow stopped directly outside his bars, the silence shifted. The German Shepherd sat, calm and deliberate, his gaze fixed on Michael with an intensity that felt unsettling. The other inmates jeered. "Looks like he found a new buddy," one called. Another laughed, "Guess the mutt likes ghosts." Michael kept his expression flat, refusing to react. Inside, however, something stirred, a quiet recognition that the dog was not looking at him the way men did. There was no judgment, no disdain, no pity, only watchfulness, and Shadow did not move on. He remained seated, ears perked, as if waiting. Emily noticed the moment and tilted her head. "He seems to like you," she said softly, almost more to herself than to Michael. Michael didn't answer. He leaned back on his bunk, pretending indifference, though his heart beat heavier in his chest than it had in years. The weight of the gaze unsettled him. This was no ordinary animal. He had seen police dogs before, trained for aggression, sharp and commanding. Shadow was different, quiet, still but impossible to ignore. Minutes passed, the other inmates growing bored when nothing happened. They shifted their taunts to new targets, their voices echoing down the row. Yet Shadow stayed, anchored by something unseen. Emily tugged gently at the leash, but the dog resisted, keeping his eyes on Michael as though he had found something worth holding on to. Finally, Emily sighed and allowed him the moment. "All right, Shadow," she whispered. "Your choice." Michael turned his gaze away, staring at the wall, determined not to let a dog unravel him. But deep down, he knew this encounter had cracked the surface of his silence. The others might forget by nightfall, but Michael wouldn't. Shadow had chosen him, and that choice, though he fought to deny it, was not something he could easily escape. The novelty of a dog on death row didn't fade quickly. For days after Shadow's first walk down the corridor, conversations rippled through the unit. Some inmates mocked the idea, others shrugged it off, but everyone noticed the German Shepherd's peculiar interest in Michael Harris. The guards, too, traded opinions during late-night coffee breaks in the control room. Ruiz leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, a skeptical grin on his face. "I'll tell you right now, this is a waste of state money. You think a dog's gonna fix broken men? These guys are waiting for a needle, not a second chance." Officer Barnes, older and more jaded, nodded. "Exactly. They should have left Shadow to live out his retirement on some farm, not sniffing around killers." Emily Carter listened, her jaw tightening. She had expected pushback, but hearing it voiced so bluntly still stung. "You're both missing the point," she said firmly. "It's not about fixing them, it's about giving them a piece of humanity while they're still here. And maybe, just maybe, it changes the way they leave this place." Barnes snorted. "That's soft talk, Carter. Don't let these men fool you. They'll use anything, kindness, programs, even a dog, to manipulate us. Don't forget where you work." But Ruiz glanced at her with a flicker of doubt. "Still, I've never seen Harris react to anything before. Maybe there's something there. Or maybe Shadow just likes the quiet ones." On the row itself, Michael resisted the intrusion. The first few times Shadow appeared outside his cell again, Michael kept his gaze fixed on the far wall, determined not to acknowledge the animal. He hated the idea of others watching him slip, hated the thought of becoming entertainment in a place where weakness was currency. "Hey, Ghost!" one inmate jeered from across the corridor. "Your new girlfriend's here." Laughter followed, sharp and cruel, bouncing off concrete. Michael's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He refused to give them the satisfaction of a response. Silence was his weapon, his shield, and he wielded it with practiced precision. Yet Shadow's patience was disarming. Unlike the men, the dog didn't push, didn't mock, didn't demand. He simply sat, breathing steadily, eyes locked on Michael with that same unflinching calm. Minutes stretched into hours, and the dog never seemed in a hurry to move on. Emily noticed the subtle tension. One afternoon she crouched near the bars, her hand resting on Shadow's leash. "He doesn't usually act like this," she said softly, her tone gentle, almost conversational. "He seems to want something from you." Michael didn't look at her. His voice, low and rough from disuse, carried only one word: nothing. It was the first time Emily had ever heard him speak. She blinked, caught off guard, but chose not to press further. Instead, she nodded once, stood, and guided Shadow to continue down the row. Inside, Michael felt the slip. He had broken his vow of silence, however briefly. The sound of his own voice startled him more than it did her. He told himself it didn't matter, that it was just one word. But in a place where years passed without a syllable, that single word felt like a crack in a dam. The guards didn't miss it either. Ruiz mentioned it later to Emily, shaking his head. "One word, that's all he gave you. But for him, that's a damn miracle." Michael, though, refused to see it that way. To him, Shadow represented an unwelcome test, a challenge to the numbness he had carefully built. He didn't want comfort, didn't want connection. He wanted the silence back, the safety of being untouchable. But Shadow had no intention of letting him disappear again. The corridor buzzed with the restless noise of men trapped in endless sameness. Cards slapped against metal tables, voices rose in insults or hollow laughter, and the guards moved with weary precision through their routines. But when Shadow appeared, the tone of the block shifted. Some fell quiet, others jeered, but everyone watched. Michael sat on his bunk, staring at the concrete floor as the German shepherd padded closer. He told himself he wouldn't look, wouldn't give in. Yet the soft rhythm of paws against cement drew his attention despite himself. Shadow stopped at his cell again, lowering his body with the patience of stone, his dark eyes fixed on Michael. "You again," Michael muttered under his breath, so low it was nearly lost in the noise. Emily, standing beside the dog, froze. She had been certain he would ignore the animal as always. Her eyes darted to Michael, searching his face for any sign of change. But his expression remained flat, his voice gravelly from disuse. Shadow's ears perked at the sound, and the dog let out a low huff, almost like an acknowledgement. For the first time in 12 years, Michael had spoken voluntarily. Not to another inmate, not to a guard, not even to himself, but to a dog. Ruiz, walking his rounds nearby, stopped in his tracks. Did he just... He looked at Emily, disbelief crossing his features. Emily's lips curved in the faintest smile. "Yeah," she said quietly. He did. Inside his chest, Michael felt his heart pound harder than it should have. He hadn't planned to speak. The words had slipped past his defenses uninvited, and the weight of them lingered in the air. He expected laughter from the men around him, but none came. They had been watching, waiting, and now they were caught in the same stunned silence as the guards. Shadow shifted forward, his nose pressing lightly toward the bars, as if he had won something invisible. Michael leaned back against the wall, his jaw clenched. "Don't look at me like that," he whispered harshly. Emily tilted her head. "Like what?" Michael finally looked at her, his eyes sharp, but there was no anger behind them, only fear of exposure. "Like I matter," he said. His voice was steadier this time, rough but deliberate. The corridor fell even quieter. A few inmates exchanged glances, uncertain whether to laugh or remain silent. No one expected this from Harris, the ghost, the man who never spoke. Emily chose her response carefully. "Maybe you do," she said softly. Michael turned away, burying his face in the shadows of his cell. He didn't want her words. He didn't want this dog, or the eyes of the row, or the stirring in his chest that felt dangerously close to life. He wanted silence, and yet silence no longer felt as protective as before. The guards carried the story with them after their shifts, retelling it like a rumor that grew with each retelling. "He spoke to the dog," Ruiz said more than once, still shaking his head in disbelief. Some dismissed it as meaningless, a fluke. Others weren't so sure. Michael, meanwhile, lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, replaying the moment in his mind. The sound of his own voice haunted him. He hadn't heard it in years, and now it echoed, relentless, as though Shadow had dragged something out from the grave he had dug inside himself. He pressed his hands against his eyes, whispering into the darkness, "This doesn't change anything." But deep down he knew the dam had cracked. and once a barrier begins to break, it rarely holds for long. The next time Shadow arrived, the row held its breath. The men didn't admit it, but curiosity rippled through them. They wanted to see if Harris, the ghost who had spoken to no one, would break again. Michael sat on his bunk, hands resting on his knees, his expression carved from stone. When Shadow padded closer, he felt the air tighten around him, as if everyone leaned in to listen. The dog stopped at his usual spot, lowering himself into a patient sit. Michael's eyes flicked toward him, then away. Emily crouched by the bars, keeping her tone light. "He likes you," she said. Michael let out a slow breath. "Dogs don't like people like me." Emily tilted her head. "That's not true. Shadow worked years on the street. He knows people better than most of us do." "If he chose your cell, there's a reason." Michael almost laughed, though the sound caught in his throat. "What reason could there be?" "Maybe he sees more than you want him to," she answered simply. For the first time in over a decade, Michael engaged in something resembling dialogue. His voice was rough, unpracticed, but steady enough to carry. "Do you think he knows my story?" "No," Emily said, glancing at Shadow, whose ears twitched. "I think he knows your silence, and he doesn't believe it." Michael leaned back, studying her. He expected condescension, but her eyes carried no judgment. Just curiosity. It disarmed him in ways he hadn't prepared for. "Why do you care?" he asked. Emily hesitated, then answered honestly. "Because I've seen what happens when men rot in here without a single connection left. It's worse than dying. If a dog can reach you, then maybe you don't have to rot." The words hit harder than he wanted to admit. Michael turned his gaze to Shadow, who sat calmly, tongue lolling just slightly, breathing slow and steady. For reasons he couldn't explain, Michael whispered, "You're wasting your time." But Shadow stayed, and Emily didn't move. The corridor had grown quieter. Even the men who usually filled the air with sarcasm kept silent, sensing the fragile line being crossed. Ruiz passed by, raising an eyebrow at the sight of Harris actually speaking. "Careful, Carter," he muttered. "Next thing you know, he'll be asking for a leash." Emily ignored him. Michael, surprisingly, didn't retreat. "What's his story?" he asked, his voice low. Emily glanced at the dog, then back at Michael. "Shadow spent 8 years as a K9, found missing kids, caught armed suspects, sniffed out drugs. He's been kicked, hit, even shot at, but he never stopped doing his job. When his body started slowing down, he was retired." Michael's eyes softened despite himself. "So he was useful once, and now he's thrown in here with us." Emily shook her head. "Not thrown, chosen. He's here because he still has something to give." The words lingered in the air, heavier than she intended. Michael clenched his hands, unsettled by the parallel. He wanted to reject it, but something inside him resisted. "Maybe," he said finally, voice almost a whisper. "He's just too stubborn to quit." Emily smiled faintly. "Or maybe so are you." Michael looked away, but the crack had widened. For the first time in years, he was having a conversation, small, halting, fragile, but real. He didn't know if he hated it or needed it. Perhaps both. Shadow shifted closer to the bars, pressing his body against the cold steel. Michael's eyes met his, and in that quiet gaze, something unspoken passed between man and animal. The silence had been broken, and once it breaks, it never returns the same. Michael found himself speaking more often, though never with ease. Words felt foreign in his mouth, heavy from years of silence, yet Shadow's presence made them surface. The dog never judged, never interrupted, never carried tales from cell to cell. He was simply there, steady and unshakable. And in that stillness, Michael began to let pieces of himself slip out. At first it was small things, offhand remarks about the weather, or muttered comments when a guard slid his tray through the slot. But soon the words grew heavier, pulled from corners of memory he had long buried. One afternoon, as Shadow sat quietly outside his cell, Michael spoke without prompting. His voice was low, rough. "You remind me of a dog I had when I was a kid, back in Texas. His name was Duke. Used to follow me everywhere, even when my old man told me to leave him outside. Emily, who had been standing nearby, leaned slightly closer but said nothing, letting the moment breathe. Michael's eyes grew distant, fixed on a point far beyond the concrete. My father was strict, too strict. He thought the only way to keep boys in line was with a heavy hand. I used to swear I'd never turn out like him, but maybe I turned out worse. Shadow tilted his head, ears flicking as if listening. Michael let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. I wasn't always like this. I used to dream about leaving that town, finding something better. For a while I thought I had it. Friends, a car, freedom. But one night was all it took to burn everything down. Emily finally spoke, her voice gentle. What happened? His jaw tightened. The words scraped their way out. I lost my best friend. We were young, reckless. One mistake and he was gone. I told myself it wasn't my fault, but deep down I knew I'd pushed too far. After that I stopped caring where the road led. As long as it was away from the guilt. The silence that followed was thick but not empty. The other inmates, usually quick with sarcasm, stayed quiet, as if recognizing something sacred was unfolding. Michael lowered his voice further, almost a whisper, meant only for Shadow. And then came the robbery. I didn't even pull the trigger. But that doesn't matter, does it? A man died. That's on me. His family, they'll never forget. Why should I get to? His chest ached with the confession. For years the weight had pressed down silently. Now, spoken aloud, it felt both heavier and lighter, as if naming it gave it shape. Emily swallowed hard, her eyes steady on him. Carrying it alone doesn't make it less real, it just makes you drown. Michael looked at her sharply, then back at the dog. Shadow's gaze held him, steady and unblinking. Michael's voice cracked. Sometimes I think that's what I deserve. For a long moment, no one spoke. The row, usually buzzing with tension, had fallen into a rare stillness. The guards at the end of the corridor exchanged glances, but didn't intervene. They too sensed this wasn't the time to break it. Michael exhaled slowly, his hands trembling against his knees. You don't know what it's like, he murmured. To carry a silence so deep, it feels like it's eating you alive. But Shadow did not move. He stayed pressed to the bars, offering no answers, only presence. And in that, Michael found the first sliver of relief he'd known in years. The silence he once used to hide was becoming a silence in which he could finally be heard. Word spread quickly on the row. Michael Harris, the man who had spent years cloaked in silence, was speaking again, if only to a dog. To most inmates, it was strange enough to become instant fuel for mockery. During yard time, one prisoner called out, "Hey, Harris! Teach your mutt to fetch us cigarettes next time." Laughter echoed through the fenced space, bouncing against the concrete walls. Another added, "Careful, Ghost. That dog's the only one who'll mourn you when they stick the needle in." Michael kept his eyes on the ground, jaw set. He had endured insults before, but this was different. They weren't mocking his crime or his sentence. They were mocking his one fragile connection, the only thing that had cracked his silence, and that made every word sting sharper. Inside the block, the tension carried over. Inmates hissed through the bars when Shadow padded down the corridor. "Look at him, sitting like a priest for confession," one sneered. Another muttered, "Man's losing his mind." Talking to animals like they understand. But the guards weren't united either. Some joined the ridicule. Officer Barnes smirked as he passed Michael's cell. "What's next, Harris? Gonna knit the dog a sweater?" His tone was mocking, but his eyes carried something harsher. Disdain for the idea that death row deserved tenderness. Emily bristled. She confronted him later in the break room, her voice sharp. "You think mocking him helps? The program's working. Harris is opening up for the first time in years." Barnes rolled his eyes. "Working? He's talking to a dog, Carter. That's not progress. That's pathetic. You give these men an inch, they'll drag you down with them." Ruiz, sitting at the table with his coffee, lifted an eyebrow. "I don't know, Barnes. I've worked here 20 years and I've never seen Harris say a damn word. Now he's talking, that's something." Barnes scoffed. "Hope's a dangerous thing to give dead men." Emily's hands curled into fists. Hope isn't for them, it's for us. For remembering they're still human. The argument cut deeper than she intended. She stormed out, leaving the room heavy with unspoken tension. Michael felt the weight of the conflict as well. Though he never heard the debates among staff, he sensed the shifting atmosphere. Some guards lingered longer near his cell, their expressions unreadable. Some avoided him altogether. Among inmates, his new vulnerability made him a target for ridicule, yet Shadow's presence continued. Day after day the dog appeared at his bars, unbothered by taunts, unmoved by hostility. Each time Michael felt torn between the safety of retreat and the fragile pull of connection. One evening, when the jeers grew louder, Michael finally snapped. "Shut your mouths," he growled, his voice carrying down the corridor. It startled the men who hadn't heard him raise his tone in years. The silence that followed was thick. Then a mocking laugh rang out. "Look at that, the ghost's alive after all." Michael closed his eyes, his chest heaving. The anger wasn't really for them, it was for himself, for letting this dog, this program, unravel the walls he had built, for letting strangers see his cracks. Yet when he opened his eyes again, Shadow was still there, steady and calm as though nothing had happened. The dog's quiet loyalty cut through the chaos. Michael exhaled slowly. For the first time, he realized that silence was no longer his only defense. Something else was forming, a fragile thread he didn't yet understand but couldn't ignore. And with every visit, that thread grew harder to sever. Breakfast came the same as always, rubbery eggs, stale toast, watery coffee. Michael sat on his bunk, staring at the tray, not hungry. Most mornings he ate only out of habit, the food little more than fuel. But today he hesitated, his eyes shifting toward the corridor where Shadow usually appeared. When the dog came by later with Emily, Michael did something he hadn't done in years. He broke his toast in half and slid the pieces to the edge of the slot in his bars. Shadow sniffed, tail thumping softly, before taking the offering with deliberate gentleness. The guards nearby exchanged glances. It was a small act, almost invisible in the noise of the block, but for Michael it was monumental. Emily's voice softened. "He trusts you." Michael shook his head. "No, I just had food I didn't want." But the truth pressed against his denial. He hadn't shared anything in years, not a word, not a thought, not a single piece of himself. Giving up bread to a dog wasn't survival, it was choice. Later that afternoon, Ruiz walked the row and caught sight of Shadow lying close to Michael's bars, his head resting on the concrete, calm as if guarding him. Ruiz paused. "You feed him?" Michael looked up, his expression unreadable. He seemed hungry. Ruiz smirked, but it wasn't cruel. "Funny. 12 years I've watched you turn away from everyone. Then a dog shows up and you're saving him scraps." Michael didn't answer, but the words lingered. The act didn't go unnoticed by the other inmates. Some mocked him, of course. "Hey, Harris, what's next? You two gonna share a pillow?" One man cackled. Another added, "Guess Ghost finally found a best friend." Michael's hands tightened into fists, but instead of anger, he felt something else, something like defiance. They could laugh all they wanted. Shadow wasn't a weakness. He was the only thing that reminded Michael he still had something to give. That evening, when dinner came, Michael repeated the gesture. He slid a piece of cornbread through the bars. Shadow accepted it with the same quiet gratitude. Emily caught the exchange, her eyes softening. "He doesn't take food from just anyone," she said. Michael avoided her gaze. Maybe he's desperate. But deep inside, he knew that wasn't true. Shadow's calm, deliberate manner carried no desperation. It carried choice, just as Michael's act had. The guards began to notice changes too. He stood taller, his voice came easier when spoken, and there was a faint steadiness in his demeanor that hadn't been there before. They didn't say it aloud, but they saw the shift. Barnes, however, muttered under his breath during rounds, "Don't be fooled." A man like Harris doesn't change. Yet even he couldn't deny that something different lingered in the air around the cell. That night, Michael sat cross-legged on his bunk, staring at the empty tray by his feet. His chest felt heavier, but not with despair, heavier with the strange weight of having given something, however small. He thought of the man he used to be, the boy who once shared everything with a dog named Duke. He whispered into the dimness, "Haven't had anyone to share with in a long time." Shadow shifted against the bars, as if he understood. Michael lay back, closing his eyes. For the first time in years, the silence felt less like a grave and more like a space waiting to be filled. The letter arrived folded neatly, tucked into an envelope with handwriting Michael recognized instantly, though he hadn't seen it in over a decade. His heart clenched when Ruiz slid it through the slot. For a long time, he didn't touch it, just stared at the name on the front, Rachel Harris, his daughter. He picked it up slowly, the paper trembling in his hands. For 12 years he had lived as though she had erased him from her life, and now, against every expectation, she had written. He opened it carefully, his chest tight, his eyes scanning the words that seemed to blur as he read. "Dad, I don't know why I'm writing this. I saw something about the dog program in the news. They said a prisoner on death row spoke for the first time in years because of it. I knew it was you. I don't know what to feel. Part of me wants to hate you forever, but another part just wants to understand." Michael swallowed hard, his throat aching. "I'm not saying I forgive you. I can't. But I also can't keep pretending you don't exist. If that dog can bring something out of you, maybe there's something left to hear. Maybe you're not completely gone. Rachel." He folded the paper, pressing it to his chest, unable to breathe for a moment. Memories of her flooded his mind, the way her laugh used to fill the house, the softness of her hand in his, the last look she gave him before turning away in that visiting room so many years ago. Shadow arrived later that day as if on cue. Michael sat hunched on his bunk, the letter clutched in one hand. Emily noticed immediately. "What's that?" she asked. Michael hesitated, then answered quietly, "My daughter." Her eyes widened slightly. "She wrote to you?" He nodded, his voice breaking. "First time since I've been here. She says she doesn't forgive me. But she wrote. That's more than I deserve." Shadow settled against the bars, his eyes locked on Michael's, steady and calm. Michael's own gaze dropped back to the letter. He whispered almost to himself, "I don't know how to answer her. What do you say to someone whose life you ruined?" Emily's voice was soft, careful. "You don't start with answers. You start with truth." Michael let the silence stretch, his breathing uneven. Finally, he looked at her, his eyes raw. "What if the truth makes her hate me more?" "Then at least she'll know you didn't hide from it," Emily replied. Michael looked down at Shadow, who had pressed his body firmly against the steel. The weight of guilt was crushing, but beneath it flickered something unfamiliar, hope, fragile and terrifying. That night, long after lights out, Michael sat with a pencil and blank sheet of paper Ruiz had slipped him quietly. He stared at the page for hours before finally writing the first line. "Rachel, I don't deserve this chance, but I'm grateful you gave it anyway." His hand trembled as he continued, each word a battle between shame and the desperate need to be heard. By the time he stopped, the page was filled with confessions, regrets, and the barest spark of love he thought he had lost. He folded it, set it aside, and whispered into the darkness, "Please let this reach her." Shadow's steady breathing lingered in his memory, as if reminding him he wasn't alone in facing the past he had spent so long running from. Officer Daniel Ruiz had walked the tiers of Angola's death row long enough to see men unravel in every imaginable way. Some raged against the walls, some tried to fight fate with lawsuits and appeals, others simply decayed in silence until the day came. But none of them had ever shifted the air of the block the way Michael Harris was starting to. It wasn't just the dog. Ruiz had seen therapy programs come and go, most fading into routine without real impact. This was different. Harris was changing, slowly, cautiously, but undeniably. Ruiz noticed it in the way he carried himself, in the way his voice returned like an old tool pulled out of storage. Even the other inmates, though mocking at first, had quieted their jeers when Shadow came near his cell. One afternoon, Ruiz lingered while Emily and Shadow sat outside Michael's bars. He pretended to check the logbook, but his ears stayed sharp. Michael was speaking in that low, hesitant voice of his. I wrote her back. My daughter. Don't know if she'll read it. Don't even know if I should have tried. Emily responded gently. You did the right thing. She reached out. And you answered. That's more than silence ever gave her. Michael rubbed his forehead, his voice breaking slightly. I don't deserve her forgiveness. Ruiz felt something stir in his chest, something uncomfortable. He wasn't used to pitying inmates, but this wasn't pity, it was recognition. He'd seen too many men waste away without ever reaching for a single thing outside these walls. Harris was at least trying. Later that evening, Ruiz sat in the break room across from Barnes, who was nursing his third cup of stale coffee. You know, Ruiz began carefully, that program might be worth something after all. Barnes snorted. Don't tell me you're falling for Carter's bleeding heart nonsense. Harris is still a murderer. Dog or no dog, nothing changes that. Ruiz held his gaze steady. I've watched men give up completely in here. Harris hasn't. Not anymore, that counts for something. Barnes rolled his eyes. Counts for what? He's still gonna die here. Doesn't matter if he pets a dog on the way out. Ruiz leaned back, his voice quiet but firm. Maybe it matters to him. Maybe it matters to the daughter who wrote him. Maybe it even matters to us, to know not every man in here dies hollow. Barnes muttered something under his breath and went back to his coffee, but Ruiz knew he'd struck a nerve. In the days that followed, Ruiz made small gestures, subtle, almost invisible. He gave Michael a little extra time in the library, not enough to raise suspicion, just enough for him to borrow books he hadn't touched in years. He lingered by his cell longer than necessary, asking simple questions. How's the book? Or, any word back from your girl? Michael usually answered with a shrug or a muttered word, but Ruiz saw the difference. One evening, as Ruiz passed, Michael surprised him. Why do you care? Ruiz paused, his hand resting on the bars. For a long moment he didn't answer. Then he said quietly, because I've seen too many men go to their end with nothing left. If you've got a chance to leave this world with something, even just a letter from your kid, I don't want to see you throw it away. Michael looked at him, eyes narrowing with cautious respect. He didn't reply, but Ruiz could tell the words landed. The truth was simple. Ruiz had become an ally, not by plan, not by program, but because a man and a dog had reminded him that humanity was worth protecting, even on death row. The letter Michael had written weighed on him like a stone. He didn't know if Rachel had read it, didn't know if she had torn it up or thrown it away. The uncertainty gnawed at him through the long nights, when the prison grew so still that every breath echoed. One night, the weight became too much. Michael sat on the edge of his bunk, his elbows on his knees, staring at the floor. His chest felt tight, his hands trembling. Shadow lay by the bars, silent and patient as always, his dark eyes fixed on him. Michael's voice cracked into the emptiness. I killed a man. The words burst out like a confession dragged from deep within. I didn't mean to. I wasn't the one who pulled the trigger. But it doesn't matter, does it? He's gone. And I was there. I made it happen. The row went quiet. Even the usual mutters and snores from other cells faded into silence. Guards at the far end of the corridor stopped in mid-step, turning their heads toward the sound of a man who had carried silence for over a decade, finally breaking open. Michael pressed his fists against his eyes. Every night I see his face. I hear the sound. I see my daughter's eyes when she realized her father was nothing but a criminal. His voice dropped lower, shaking. And I'm afraid. Afraid I'm going to die here with no one remembering me for anything but what I destroyed. His chest heaved, breaths uneven. Tears slipped down his cheeks, hot against skin that hadn't felt them in years. He tried to wipe them away, ashamed, but they came faster. Shadow moved closer, pressing his body against the bars, a steady presence against the storm unraveling inside Michael. The dog didn't flinch, didn't move, didn't judge. He just stayed. Michael's voice broke completely. Why won't you leave me alone? Emily, standing nearby, swallowed hard. She wanted to say something, to offer comfort, but she sensed this wasn't hers to interrupt. This was between Michael and the animal that had broken through walls no human could touch. Michael's shoulders shook as he lowered himself onto the cold floor, leaning his forehead against the steel. Shadow pressed his paw through the gap, resting it near Michael's hand. Slowly, almost instinctively, Michael's trembling fingers closed around it. The gesture undid him completely. He wept openly now, his sobs raw and unfiltered, echoing down the corridor. Hardened guards, men who had spent decades keeping their distance, turned away with tight jaws. Some fought back moisture in their eyes, unwilling to admit how deeply it cut to see a condemned man break not from anger, but from grief and fear. Michael whispered hoarsely, "I don't want to die forgotten." The silence that followed was thick, not of indifference, but of reverence. For years, Harris had been a ghost among them. Now he was undeniably human, fragile and broken, yet alive in a way none of them had ever seen. Minutes passed before his sobs softened, his breathing slowing. His forehead still pressed to the steel, his hand still clutching Shadow's paw, Michael whispered almost like a prayer, "Thank you." The dog gave no reply, only the steady beat of his presence, the rhythm of his breath, a grounding anchor. That night, for the first time in years, Michael slept deeply. The weight of confession hadn't erased his guilt, but it had freed him from silence. And as the guards resumed their rounds, the image stayed with them. A man who had once seemed already dead, held together in his darkest hour by the quiet loyalty of a dog. The morning began like any other. Keys jangling, trays sliding through slots, the stale rhythm of prison life grinding forward. But for Michael Harris, something had shifted. His breakdown the night before had left him emptied yet strangely lighter, as if the air in his cell no longer pressed so hard against his chest. When Shadow appeared again, padding down the corridor with his steady gait, Michael rose from his bunk without hesitation. The usual chorus of inmate jeers followed, though quieter than before. Even the most cynical men seemed subdued, uncertain of what to make of Harris's unraveling the night prior. Shadow stopped in front of his cell, lowering himself into his familiar spot. Michael approached the bars slowly, his hands trembling but steady enough to reach through. He crouched down, his forehead pressing against the cold steel. In a voice barely louder than a whisper, he said, "Thank you." The dog shifted forward, placing his paw against Michael's hand. And then something happened that froze the entire block. Michael began to cry, openly, unashamed, his body shaking with sobs. Not the quiet tears of a man hiding in his bunk, but the raw, visible grief of someone finally breaking free of years of silence. The guards stopped in their tracks. Barnes, usually quick with scorn, stood motionless, his mouth slightly open. Ruiz, watching from a few cells away, felt his throat tighten. He had seen hardened criminals spit in the face of their execution, but he had never seen one collapse with such humility. Inmates who had once mocked now fell silent, staring with wide eyes. The corridor, usually filled with noise and tension, became a hushed witness to something none of them expected. Emily knelt beside Shadow, her eyes stinging. "Michael," she said softly, her voice careful not to break the moment. He lifted his face, tears streaking down the lines of age and regret. "I've spent years pretending I was already dead, but His hand tightened around Shadow's paw. "He reminded me I'm still human, even if it's too late." The words rang through the block, echoing against the steel and concrete. Guards exchanged uneasy glances, unsure whether to intervene or let the moment unfold. For once, no one moved. Michael pressed his forehead harder against the bars, his shoulders trembling. "I don't deserve kindness. I don't deserve forgiveness. But this dog, he doesn't care about what I did, he just stays." The silence that followed was heavier than any noise the row had ever known. Barnes muttered under his breath, though there was no mockery in his tone this time. "Damn." Ruiz finally spoke, his voice rough. "Sometimes it takes a dog to do what we can't." Michael exhaled shakily, his body beginning to calm. He wiped at his face with trembling hands, but the weight of shame that had pressed down on him for so long seemed lighter. He wasn't free, not in any legal sense, but in that moment he was no longer the ghost who had walked death row in silence. He was a man, flawed, guilty, condemned, but undeniably alive. The guards would remember this day. Hardened men who had seen every shade of despair would carry with them the image of Harris, broken yet reborn, holding a dog's paw as if it were the only thing tethering him to the world. And in a way, it was. The echoes of Michael's breakdown lingered long after the moment had passed. Death Row was a place where stories rarely lasted more than a few hours, quickly replaced by new rumors or conflicts. But this one stuck. Everyone had seen it, the ghost of Angola crying into a dog's paw. It became something men whispered about during yard time, voices low, not with ridicule this time, but with a strange kind of respect. Michael noticed the difference almost immediately. Inmates who once mocked him fell silent when he passed. A few even nodded in quiet acknowledgement, as though recognizing something they couldn't name. He hadn't asked for it, but the shift was undeniable. Inside himself, Michael felt something stirring he hadn't felt in years. The silence was still there, but it no longer smothered him. It was space he could fill with thought, with reflection, even with purpose. Shadow continued his visits faithful as ever. Each time, Michael found himself talking more, not just about regret, but about what he wished he could tell others. One afternoon, he spoke to a younger inmate in the neighboring cell, a man barely in his 20s facing a life sentence. "Don't waste yourself the way I did," Michael said quietly through the bars. "Don't shut down and pretend you're already gone. You still have years ahead. Use them." The younger man laughed at first, dismissive. But later, Michael heard him pacing his cell, restless, as though the words had burrowed deep. Emily noticed the change too. "You're different," she told him one evening. "Not just with Shadow, but with the men around you. They're listening." Michael shook his head, a sad smile touching his lips. "I'm no preacher. I've got nothing worth teaching." "You're wrong," Emily replied firmly. "You've lived what they're living. You've walked further into despair than most men ever will. If you can speak from that and still find something human left, that's worth more than you think." The thought unsettled Michael, yet also warmed him in ways he couldn't explain. Then came another letter. Ruiz slid it through with an almost cautious expression. Michael froze when he saw the handwriting again, Rachel. His hands shook as he opened it, afraid of what he might find. "Dad, I read your letter. I didn't expect to. I almost threw it away, but I didn't. And when I finished, I cried. I don't know if I forgive you. Not yet, maybe not ever. But for the first time, I believe you're sorry. For the first time, I believe you mean it. I want to come see you. Rachel." Michael sat back heavily on his bunk, the letter trembling in his hands. His breath caught, and for a long moment he couldn't speak. Shadow pressed closer to the bars, as though sensing the weight of the moment. Emily asked softly, "What does it say?" Michael's voice broke as he whispered, "She wants to visit." The words hung in the air, fragile and staggering. His daughter, the girl who had once pressed her hands to glass, begging for answers he couldn't give, was reaching back across the chasm of years. He lowered the letter, tears burning his eyes, and whispered to Shadow, "She's coming." The thought terrified him as much as it filled him with hope. He didn't know what he would say, didn't know if he was strong enough to face her. But he knew one thing with certainty. He was no longer the ghost of Angola. He was a man preparing, however painfully, to meet his daughter again. The day of Rachel's visit arrived heavy with anticipation. For years, Michael had braced himself for silence from her, convinced she would never look his way again. Now the possibility of seeing her filled him with a nervous energy he hadn't felt since he was a young man. He sat on the edge of his bunk, hands clasped, heart racing faster than he could calm. Shadow lay by the bars, his steady presence grounding him. Michael leaned down, whispering, "She's coming. After all these years, she's really coming." His voice trembled, a mix of fear and awe. When Rachel entered the visiting room, Michael felt time collapse. She was no longer the 9-year-old girl pressing her hands to glass. She was a grown woman now, her features a mirror of her mother's, but her eyes still carrying the spark he remembered. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Rachel broke the silence. "You look older," she said softly. Michael swallowed hard. "I am." Her hands tightened on the table between them. "I almost didn't come." "I know," Michael whispered. "I wouldn't have blamed you if you hadn't." Tears welled in Rachel's eyes, though she fought to steady herself. "Why now, Dad? Why start talking after all this time?" Michael glanced toward the hallway where he knew Shadow waited beyond. "Because someone reminded me I was still alive, that I couldn't leave this world without at least trying to make things right with you." Rachel studied him for a long moment. "I don't know if I can forgive you." "You don't have to," Michael said quickly, his voice breaking. "I don't deserve it. All I ask is that you remember I loved you, even when I was too broken to show it." Her lips trembled. Then, almost reluctantly, she reached across the table, her hand brushing his. The contact was brief but real, enough to shatter the years of distance between them. When the visit ended, Michael walked back to his cell with Ruiz by his side. The older guard spoke quietly. "That took guts, Harris. More than most men ever show." Michael gave a faint, tired smile. "It wasn't me, it was that dog." Back in his cell, Shadow was waiting. Michael crouched by the bars, pressing his hand to the dog's fur. "She came, boy," he whispered. "She came." His voice cracked, but this time the tears that followed weren't only grief. They were gratitude. In the weeks that followed, Michael became something new on the row. Other inmates listened when he spoke, not because he demanded respect, but because he carried a truth they couldn't ignore. He told them not to waste what little life they had left, not to bury themselves before their time. To the guards, Michael was no longer just the ghost. He was proof that even on death row, where hope was supposed to die, something human could still bloom. He knew his fate hadn't changed. The sentence remained. The day would come. But he no longer feared being forgotten. His daughter had seen him again, had touched his hand. Shadow had given him back his voice, his dignity. That was enough. Michael sat one evening with Shadow pressed against the bars, his voice calm. "You saved me," he whispered. "Not from death, but from disappearing before I got there." And as the row settled into night, the men and guards alike carried with them the memory of a dog who had done what no court, no sermon, no punishment ever could, remind a condemned man that he was still human. If stories like this move you, subscribe now and don't stop here. Click on the next video waiting on your screen to keep discovering how light sometimes finds its way into the darkest places.